Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank my colleague from Wisconsin for his comments. I rise today in opposition to this agreement, and I do so because I believe it's bad for our country and bad for the world. There are very few votes we take here in the United States Senate that have such a profound effect on our national security and the kind of world our kids and our grandkids are going to inherit, as this upcoming vote we'll take next week on this nuclear deal. Over the past couple of months, I have taken the time to read the agreement carefully. I've attended the classified briefings. I've listened to my colleagues. I've talked to a lot of experts on both sides of the issue. I did take my time in coming to a decision because I was hopeful that we'd be able to have an agreement that I could support and others could as well. I've also listened to my constituents back home in Ohio. They've looked at this agreement too. They understand what's at stake, and they have strong views on it. And my calls and letters and emails are overwhelmingly opposed. Through the process, what I did was I measured the agreement not based on just some abstract concept that I might have. I actually based it on the actual objectives and criteria that were set out by the international community, the United Nations, the United States of America, our government. I looked at it based on the red lines that we had drawn. And one of my great concerns about this agreement is that those red lines have not been honored. The broad goal, of course, the biggest red line is that Congress, the Obama administration, the United Nations Security Council, everyone was very clear. Iran must stop and dismantle its nuclear weapons program. That's the most basic red line. You have to remember that when Congress, on a bipartisan basis, enacted these crippling sanctions on Iran, it was not just to bring Iran to the table, which was a result. It was actually to get them to abandon their nuclear weapons program. That was the point. I supported tougher sanctions to give leverage to the Obama administration, even though, curiously, they didn't want that leverage. They resisted Congress increasing those sanctions. In fact, they initially opposed any role for Congress in reviewing the agreement. The gentleman from Tennessee is here, chairman of the committee. He will tell you they are somehow reluctant for Congress even to have a role here, even to help them to be able to negotiate a better agreement. That was probably an indication of where we were going. Despite that resistance, serious sanctions were enacted and Iran did come to the table. I had hoped then that with firm United States leadership, leading from the front, not from behind, we'd be able to bring the international community along to ensure that we did meet those criteria I talked about earlier, longstanding U.S. international criteria. Unfortunately, after reviewing the terms of this agreement, it's explicitly clear that these red lines, these objectives, these criteria we set out have not been met. We now have an obligation to reject this deal and begin to restore the consensus, both at home and abroad, that the Iranian government must be isolated economically and diplomatically until it agrees to the longstanding terms on which the United States and the international community have long insisted. Some will say, that's fine, but that's impossible. I respectfully disagree. I respectfully quote President Obama, who has said repeatedly, no agreement is better than a bad agreement, meaning keeping the sanctions in place is better than a bad agreement. I believe that's where we are. This is a bad agreement. Among the many serious flaws of this deal is the fact that Iran can continue research and development on more advanced centrifuges and can resume enrichment in 15 years, providing at best only temporary relief. Inspections, one of the most important safeguards we have, are not anywhere, anytime, as was talked about by the administration. Under this deal, Iran can delay the inspection of suspected nuclear sites for up to 24 days. There's even a process to get to those 24 days. If the Iranians cheat, as they have in the past, we would have to employ a convoluted process to convince the international community to restore sanctions, a process I don't think we can rely on. It's also important to note that other than reimposition of sanctions, the agreement does not specify any clear mechanism to enforce outcomes of the dispute resolution process, nor does it identify penalties for failure to comply. This means that really the only realistic pre-agreed punishment for any violation, no matter how big or how small, is full reimposition of sanctions. In a way, as I look at this, this is like having the death penalty as the only punishment for all crimes. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think you're going to get the international community to go along with that. That's why I worry about the compliance and the sanctions. Given that only a full-blown Iranian violation would likely convince enough countries to reimpose all sanctions, I don't think the agreement provides the concrete tools to address less overt but still subversive forms of Iranian cheating that are designed to test international resolve and establish a new baseline for acceptable behavior. And by the way, based on past behavior, this is likely. In addition, of course, the inspections regime is subject to side deals between the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Iran. None of us are allowed to see. Contrary, by the way, to the Iran Review Act that passed Congress and was signed into law by the President of the United States. The language of that legislation is pretty clear. It requires the President to transmit to Congress, and I quote, "The agreement as defined in this section, including all materials and annexes." And then when it talks about what that means, it says, and I quote, "including annexes, appendices, codicils, side agreements, implementing materials, documents, guidance, technical understandings, and so on and so forth." It's all here. That's in the agreement that we had with the President of the United States because it was part of the Review Act that he signed into law. Based on recent press reporting, of course, we're also hearing that Iran will be allowed to self-inspect, use its own inspectors and equipment to report on possible military dimensions of past suspected nuclear activity at one of the most secretive and important military facilities at Portman. Allowing a country accused of hiding a secret and illegal nuclear weapons program to implement verification measures for a facility where this program is believed to have been hidden certainly undermines the President's claim that, and I quote, "the Iran deal is not built on trust, it is built on verification," end quote. Perhaps most troubling is that this agreement ends Iran's international isolation without ending the behavior that caused Iran to be isolated in the first place. As the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, based on our own State Department analysis, Iran's nuclear program is just one part of a broader strategy that's dangerous and destabilizing. According to some estimates, of course, Iran will receive up to $150 billion in sanctions relief early in the agreement. By the way, with or without sustained compliance, which will encourage the Iranians to cause trouble, to further support terrorist groups they sponsor. National Security Advisor Susan Rice acknowledged something that I think is pretty plain. She said Iran is sending money to these groups now while they're under sanctions, and they'll have more money to do it when the sanctions are relieved. That's the National Security Advisor. Within 5 years, the agreement lifts the embargo on conventional weapons and lifts the ballistic missile embargo within 8 years, a last-minute concession to Iran in the rush by the administration to get to yes. At a minimum, this deal will ensure that Iran remains a threshold nuclear power, but with a new set of tools and more resources to hurt our interests and those of our allies in the region, including Israel. I believe it's clear that the deal, as currently written, will set off a nuclear and conventional arms race in the Middle East. The President says the alternative to this deal is war. In fact, a Middle East bristling with arms will increase the risks of war. Increase the risks of war because of this deal. I've been involved in international negotiations. As U.S. trade representative, I understand that they can be tough. I know that both sides have to make concessions. But I also know that that does not mean that the United States of America concedes on fundamental principles, on red lines. We've got to have the courage to stand behind our legitimate public pronouncements, whether it's with the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria, whether it's the violation of both Minsk ceasefire agreements by the Russians and their proxies in eastern Ukraine, or our commitment that Iran must stop and dismantle its march toward nuclear weapons. These are all red lines. These are all things you negotiate. These are all things you have to be firm on and tough on. It's not easy, but as Americans, that's what we do. There was a speech written that was never given. It was meant to be given on November 22nd, 1963. It was the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And he said in that speech about America's role, he said, "Our generation, our nation, by destiny rather than choice, are the watchguards on the walls of world freedom. It's who we are. We've got to be tough in these negotiations and stand tall. Other countries look to us to be tall, to help build the consensus. That's what we had to do, and I believe we did not do, in this, what I'm sure was a very difficult negotiation. We have to honor our red lines. If we expect them to be effective in promoting peace and stability, we must lead. In particular, we've got to say what we mean and mean what we say if we're going to stop nuclear proliferation. The way this agreement developed, I think, will encourage other countries who are interested in pursuing nuclear weapons to say, I don't care what the UN says. I don't care what the United States says. What I see here is everything is negotiable. That's the message, I'm afraid, this agreement will send. The administration's position that the only alternative to this agreement is war, that's what they're saying. As noted, if anything, I think this agreement will further destabilize an already turbulent region. But there is an alternative. The alternative to this bad deal is a better deal. Supporters of this agreement have compared this agreement to Ronald Reagan's arms control negotiations with the Soviets. I want to just touch on that for a moment because I've heard a lot of that here on the floor. I take a very different lesson from that analogy to Ronald Reagan. President Reagan succeeded by raising the pressure, not reducing it. He increased the cost of bad behavior until that behavior changed. He didn't strike a deal unless it fulfilled the core goals that he laid out, his red lines. He didn't want a deal for a deal's sake, and he was patient. At the Reykjavik summit, you may remember, in 1986, Ronald Reagan walked away from what would have been a major nuclear disarmament agreement with the Soviets because he felt that the costs to U.S. national security were too high. He was criticized for walking away. But he kept trying. He held firm. And a year later, he successfully concluded negotiations on the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This body must not sign off on an agreement that fails to honor our red lines, that strengthens Iran's destabilizing influence in the region and does nothing to address the behavior that threatens our allies and our legitimate national security interests here in this country. We should reject this agreement with Iran and tighten those sanctions on a bipartisan basis. The president should then use the leverage that only America possesses to negotiate an international agreement that does meet the longstanding goals of the United Nations, of the international community, of the United States of America, of this Congress, and the President himself. We can't afford to get this one wrong, folks. We owe it to our children and grandchildren to get this right. As noted in the beginning of my remarks, this is about what kind of world they're going to inherit. I urge my colleagues in the Senate to join me in rejecting this deal and pursuing a better way. I yield back my time.